Welcome everybody to the call. This is the Climate Reality Project's quarterly meeting, and it is a follow-up to the February meeting where we had the Climate Action Task Force presentation, because that had just come forward to the city in December. And part of that was the recommendation. So the Climate Action Task Force, for those of you who don't know, was put together by the city to help come up with recommendations to help us move towards 100% clean energy. And so one of the recommendations is looking at the options of public power. So with that, we wanted to follow up and have a discussion, an information meeting about that possibility. And if you would like to learn more about the recommendations from the Climate Action Task Force, you can look it up. You can just Google Climate Action Task Force, cityofbellingham.org. If somebody wants to put that link in the chat for somebody to pull up, you can. But otherwise, you can Google that yourself to read more about that work. And so part of the process in exploring public power is to learn more, which most of you, it sounds like, if not all of you, are here to learn more about the possibilities of that for our area. And so we have some co-hosts with our quarterly meeting, 350 Bellingham and Sierra Club and the Quakers. And we have, this is just the beginning of a much larger conversation. So want to welcome you and thank you for coming. And to start this panel, we're gonna have panelists. We are going to probably run a little bit past 8:30. We told them 7 to 10 minutes. So panelists, if you can watch your own clocks, and if you want to try to end a little sooner than your 10 minutes, that's great. We're going to run through the 5 panelists. If I'm going to get a warning at 9 minutes, and I will at that point tell you to finish wrapping up so we can stick to your 10 minutes. But they all know that it's 7 to 10 minutes. And I'm going to be recording this call starting now, and I'm going to introduce our first speaker. But before I do that, I wanted to do a little more housekeeping. The chat room or chat box is open. That's on the bottom of the call. So if anybody has anything they need to say, that will happen there. When it gets time to Q&A, we will have questions put into the chat box. So everybody's going to stay on mute if you have a question, and Daniel Kirkpatrick is going to, in fact, Daniel, if you can introduce yourself as well as Betsy before we get started, that would be great. I did not have you do that.
Greetings, Daniel Kirkpatrick. I live in the Happy Valley neighborhood. I'm a Climate Reality Project activist and also an Indigenous rights activist. And I'm really happy to be moving this conversation forward. And I will be sort of doing the gatekeeping around the Q&A part of the session. Thanks. Welcome, everybody.
That way, if we have multiple people asking the same question, he'll work with that and make sure that they can all get answered as best we can. Betsy.
Yeah, hi, I'm Betsy Gross. I'm also active with the Climate Reality Project, Bellingham chapter, and I'm just I value highly the importance of a community conversation about things that matter, and this does indeed matter. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And so we also have a couple other members of our Climate Reality leadership team that couldn't make it to the call this evening, but we had formulated the agenda for this event. And so last housekeeping item is that at the top right of your Zoom, if you haven't been on Zoom, you can do the speaker view or the gallery view. Gallery view lets you see people's names. Speaker view will have you just focused on who the speaker is. So our first speaker will be Atul. So Atul, if you can get ready to speak so that you show up in the speaker view, Betsy's there now, and I don't know if that's because you need to maybe mute Betsy. I'm not sure.
I'm ready whenever.
That's great. I want to tell the audience a little bit more about you. So Atul is an engineer by training and practice, and has also run a business and serves in local government and various nonprofit boards. He's worked to commercialize clean energy and transportation technologies with large and small companies. Atul is currently focused on local government and is presently a Whatcom PUD commissioner and Whatcom planning commissioner. Atul is exploring innovations that increases the resilience of communities. He has a hobby farm, and has been bike commuting for over 6 years, logging over 30,000 miles. He enjoys spending time with his 2 wonderful adult children, hanging at the farm, enjoying the outdoors with friends, and dancing tango. So Atul, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. So I was given some pointers for the questions I should answer. I will definitely do that, but I also want to make some introductory comments. So to me, climate reality is a subset of human-caused disruption to our ecosystem. Those disruptions are not just in our climate, but also in our bodies of water, soils, and so on. And they don't just involve carbon. Certainly, though, it is useful to focus on carbon and climate and carbon equivalents, as long as we broaden the scope when appropriate. Well, it is certainly appropriate here when we talk about public power, because public power is not just a vehicle to lower carbon, it is an opportunity for greater local control. Now, greater local control, if exercised well, can give us many things. A more robust power supply, electricity power supply, lower carbon supply, better demand side management, more local jobs, better natural resource management, and so on. I should add, given our current reality, much better fiber optic infrastructure. A PUD, so I was given some questions and I thought it'd be helpful now to answer those questions relating to what a PUD is and how the Whatcom County PUD is constituted. So firstly, a PUD in Washington State is a local government agency authorized under Proposition 1. Yeah, that's right. It was the first proposition that was passed in the state of Washington. And it's governed by RCWs, 54, I may get help on that exact number, the other numbers, but 54 is one I remember. PUDs provide industrial, residential, commercial, and agricultural water and wastewater services as well, wholesale and retail electricity, wholesale bulk telecommunications, with one exception, which is Kitsap is allowed some limited retail authority, Kitsap PUD, wholesale hydrogen services, as well as wholesale RNG, which stands for renewable natural gas. Whatcom PUD, your PUD in this county, provides industrial water from the lower Nooksack River and industrial electricity from Bonneville Power. We were constituted actually originally to be a county-wide municipal utility to provide electricity to all of the end users in the county, and basically what's called municipalize or publicly acquire the electrical distribution system of what at that time was called Puget Power, which is now called Puget Sound Energy. But there was insufficient resources back then to do that, and so instead, when the Cherryport industrial aspirations happened, which is to build refineries and for petroleum and aluminum, that became a natural anchor customer for the PUD to become a real living organization. So that's really what the PUD is today. It's very focused operationally on Cherry Point and Ferndale. There are other municipal entities, of course, in the county that provide water and electricity. Of course, Bellingham does that, Linden, Ferndale, so on. And
Did we lose him?
His computer looks like
Sumac
it's
actually also provide, enough that the electricity mix of Bonneville Power is mid-90s renewable, clean, very consistent with the targets of the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which just got passed last year. So certainly that's part of the reason why the city of Bellingham is attracted to the idea of public power, because there's potential for the city of Bellingham to also have access to that very clean electricity from Bonneville Power. So what are the benefits that right now that the community gets from the PUD? The first benefit is the support for the Cherry Point Industrial Zone. Of course, there's a lot of high wage jobs there in the Cherry Point Industrial Zone. Those associated with the refineries, the 2 petroleum refineries and the 1 aluminum refinery, of course, which is about to shut down. So notwithstanding that, the PUD has had one area where it has made substantial efforts that go beyond the in Cherry Point Industrial Zone, and that is related to water policy. Many years ago, over a decade ago, the PUD began to be active in helping chart how we look at water in this county, water resources, and became involved with numerous organizations that were created both through county action and state action in our watershed, which is called the Nooksack watershed, otherwise also known as YRO 1. And our PUD, largely due to the excellent leadership in this regard by Steve Jilk, our general manager, has established excellent rapport with everyone from native communities to agriculture groups as a facilitator of efforts to protect salmon, improve the water quality, improve the water supply, and do the things that we need to do to both conserve and improve the quality of our water. But there's many things we can do. Certainly the reason I ran was to do more good. And I ran in 2018, and I've been a commissioner for a year and a half now. And some of the new things that we can do are put an emphasis and implement community solar. There are conversations right now that we've had at the PUD about possibilities for implementing community solar. There's opportunities for community wind. There's opportunities for other aspects of renewable energy. For example, renewable natural gas. There's the potential of, I mentioned briefly about fiber. I'm very passionate about fiber because this COVID situation has really made clear to us what a crisis we have as far as communications. And it can go further than that. Certainly there are PUDs around the state which are doing amazing things that are not just implementing goals around climate and sustainability, but are also doing things with housing and economic challenges of people. For example, Snohomish County subsidizes for its lowest income people their utility bills to the tune of 60%. I've had conversations with folks about the potential that we can PUDs can do things to help the homeless. So there's a tremendous amount of possibilities that a countywide organization like the PUD can impact, and certainly that requires support from the community and a reasonable, practical plan to get there, because you can't do it all overnight, and you have to make your priorities. So I think my intention was to provide an introduction. I look forward to a question and answer, and hopefully I answered the initial questions that were laid out, but I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Atul. That was wonderful. Next up, we have Debra. And Debra Lester in here. So Debra comes from Kitsap County. She is the Kitsap Public Utility Commissioner since 2017. She's the Whatcom Public Utility District Education Committee co-chair since 2019. She was a Bainbridge Island City Council member for 3 years, or 2010 to 2013. Housing Kitsap board member from 2010 to 2013. Was also Kitsap Regional Coordinating Council from 2010 to 2013. Wore lots of hats in 2010 to 2013. Also on the Transportation Advisory Committee at that time. And then in the Puget Sound Regional Coordinating Council Transportation Policy Board. That's a big, long one there, from 2012 to 2013, as well as the Ferry Community Partnership co-founder. So Debra Lester, we welcome you to the call.
Thank you so much. I wanted to add, I am a small business owner as well. I publish an art magazine for the state of Washington. It's called Art Access Magazine. You may know it. Basically, I was asked to kind of give a little bit of information about what Kitsap does. And Kitsap PUD, we are a water, wastewater, and telecommunications utility. We are not a power utility. As of yet, our community has not petitioned us to become such. We did have one city express interest in becoming a municipal power, and that was Bainbridge Island, and the council did not go forward with it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Kitsap PUD, what we do, in hopes that it might inspire your citizens and things that you can do as well. So Kitsap PUD, we own and operate 50 separate water systems, and that basically serves 50,000 residents with clean drinking water. And in 2017, we decided to create a wastewater treatment plant that is very unique. It's a membrane bioreactor. We call it an MBR plant. And basically that bioreactor was able to have us remove a wastewater treatment plant that was sending wastewater out into the Port Gamble Bay. And so instead of wasting that water into the Sound, we were able to reclaim that water, and that water is clean. We actually tested it, and it was clean to drinking water standard. We're not doing that though. We're basically taking that water and putting it back into the ground to recharge our aquifers and help us with our streams and our stream flows. So this is certainly a thing that potentially you could consider with your PUD in terms of climate action, cleaning up the Puget Sound, and reclaiming water. Water is such a precious resource, and we see it as something to conserve, protect, and reuse. We basically, as Atul mentioned in the opening, PUDs, they were formed to provide power and water. And that was because the privates weren't doing it, and they weren't coming out to the rural areas. And our next thing that we went into had to do with telecommunications. We're at the same point where we originally began. The private companies are not building out to our rural areas. They're not bringing broadband to our rural areas. So Kitsap PUD, we in the 2000s, we along with several other PUDs formed the Northwest Open Access Network. It's the short name for it is called NOAANET. And so NOAANET, it focuses on bringing broadband to those rural areas and providing it in an affordable way. It's a publicly owned, because it's owned by publicly owned PUDs. And so our first build out, working with NOAANET, we were able to receive a $3 million grant, and we built out an entire fiber backbone for Kitsap County. And so that backbone primarily began with serving our governments, schools, libraries, first responders, as well as hospitals. And eventually people started seeing that they had such great service at the schools and the governments. We started to be petitioned by businesses and residents to build out fiber to them as well. Now, we do not have full retail authority, but in 2017, because we started building out fiber to people's homes, the individuals, much like when a water customer comes on to a water system, building that infrastructure out, the customer pays cost. It's a not-for-profit, so it's only the cost to build to their home. That basically, we were concerned that if we were building this service and the internet service provider went out of business or was not providing the service or having it be open access, we were concerned that we didn't want that investment to become stranded. We wanted them to continue to have good quality service. So we petitioned the legislature and got a law passed that allowed us to have that limited retail authority as a consumer protection. People were investing their own dollars into their internet. And so we got that authority in 2017, and we've continued to build out as individuals petition us, neighborhoods come together and say, we would like you to build to our neighborhood. And so with that petition coming to our board, we take that and we develop an estimate. And if it looks like we can do it in a cost-effective manner, and we provide the estimate to the neighborhood, and the neighborhood says yes, then we go forward with building. And the great thing is that it provides the individuals the ability to pay back that cost of building in a 20-year plan. So that's where we're at, and I look forward to answering questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I just want to make mention that Atul also added to make sure that in the chat that folks realize how important fiber is to the implementation of a clean energy grid, everything from demand management to keeping distributed generation monitoring. So that's a big piece of the overall picture. And fiber actually uses much, much less energy than wireless. So wanted to add that. Thank you so much, Debra. All right, next speaker, Froylán is next. He is an assistant professor in the Institute of Energy Studies at Western Washington University. Prior to working at Western, Froy worked with the China Energy Group at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab on greenhouse gas emissions, accounting models, electric system-wide planning, optimization, and investigating the introduction of a regional electricity market in China. While a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley, Froy spent years in China working with researchers at Tsinghua University and the State Grid Research Institute on issues related to electric vehicle deployment and demand response. So with that, Froy, if you can introduce what you're going to be talking about for this evening, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm gonna be very teachy, I guess, since I have some slides.
Yes, and I think you should be able to share your screen.
I'll try. Let's see. Here you go. I've had a lot of involuntary training, I guess, on how to run Zooms. Okay. Yeah, I'm really new to the area, so I'm actually really excited just to learn from all of you. And I'm going to share a little bit of my thoughts on this area. As I mentioned, I'm going to be very teachy, and I'm going to just talk about four main things in that order, just about the decarbonizing electricity and public power, how public utility districts can have more ambitious environmental goals, other factors perhaps when considering public power, and finally this sort of discussion of doing a PUD at the city or county level. I guess as it's perhaps relatively perhaps obvious that public power goals depend on the public. And what that means is that if the public is united in their concern for climate change and electricity system reliance on fossil fuels, then the public system might mean a cleaner power system as well. Nevertheless, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the case. I mean, this show of people so interested in cleaner environment and cleaner energy shows that that is the case, but not necessarily. Maybe is who shows to the table. Of course, other concerns in the community may lead to different focus for the public power entity. I guess here comes some of my research, which has been focused, as Jill mentioned, mostly in China. And I'm gonna maybe touch a tiny bit on that, but it doesn't quite relate. China is much larger than a public utility district, let's say. Well, but one thing is important, it's applicable in any circumstance, which is that this downward trends in cost for renewables and storage is quite a good thing for decarbonizing electricity systems. We can see, just looking at the historical data of cost, we can see the global average levelized cost of electricity, which means taking into account how much power it produces and when you're going to get paid back for utility, solar, PV, wind, and storage, has fallen significantly in the last decade. But from 2010 to 2018, solar has fallen in cost about 77%, wind by 35%, and storage by 85%. So the costs are going down dramatically. Now, in a scenario where a region or whoever provides power to a given area, assuming that the demands continues to go up, being because population grows or Bellingham becomes really popular and all the Bay Area outcasts come here, like myself, then and then lower costs at the same time, then the system that has more renewables is a system that is cheaper to run. So running a more decarbonized system is cheaper than running a business as usual scenario system. And you can label this system with other acronyms if you want. I put a little asterisk just because I said that more renewables are cheaper, but only it starts getting more expensive once we approach fully intermittent renewables. In the case of hydro, it's a little different scenario. But in theory, if we're going to depend on other solar and wind, if we increase them dramatically, it's going to be cheaper for a while and maybe not at the very tail end. So these numbers are super different for what could be in Bellingham or even in the United States, because these numbers are from a model that we worked on the Chinese case. And basically we estimated that with the reduced costs of renewables and with some other carbon constraints on the system, we modeled that the total electricity system in China could reduce its emissions dramatically. The blue line is the business as usual. And I don't know if you can translate this to human numbers, but we're talking about 4 gigatons, which is a lot of the carbon budget of the planet under the business as usual scenario. So decarbonization of this particular grid in China, which means the grid in China, is key. Now we're talking a little bit smaller, but one thing that I wanted to emphasize is on the middle part, on the second graph, in the B part. I don't know if you can see my cursor. You can see that a business as usual scenario in China, at least, the costs continue to go up because it continues to rely on coal, gas, and oil. Now, with the reduced cost assumption that we are taking into account, which is historically accurate, we see that actually that model, even when it's not only is it cleaner, which is the orange line, not only is it cleaner, it's also cheaper. So it's cheaper just to run a greener system. Now, if we impose higher demand on the system to reduce carbon emissions even more, let's say by 50%, which is, it's a big jump for the Chinese case, then costs are still cheaper than the business as usual, which is kind of dramatic. Now, my asterisk where I put in the last slide is that if we push the envelope even more, let's say to 80%, now costs start to go up. Costs are definitely more expensive, mostly because we have way more capacity, transmission, and storage. That might not be necessarily the case in a smaller scale, but the fact that the system is cheaper to run with renewables, and even with the carbon constraint, which if we have more carbon emission reduction goals, that should be a hopeful sign. I don't know if there were any questions. I cannot. Sorry. So how does PUDs and other environmental goals, I guess, relate? Is that PUDs don't necessarily have to operate at a profit, which allows the possibility to rethink the utility model of tying increased consumption with profits, or what we call decoupling. So this is really radical in a structure, in an IOU structure, which is investor-owned utility structure. And investing in efficiency, which seems to make sense, is also not so sensical in a place where you have to sell electricity to make a profit. So it's easier to be green if you need to build less demand and less infrastructure. Another hopeful area for me, at least, is that a public power system could be a more open data system, which means, from my very selfish point of view, it means more research. And research is important just because we're going to encounter problems that we don't necessarily know how to solve. And I'm going to maybe talk a little bit about those. And we can find better solutions to reduce emissions. Now, moving towards, like, one of the things that I think might be interesting, that moving towards a more decoupled system, which maybe is in the future for us if we want to really pursue efficiency and renewables and distributed generation in our future, is that we need to study how this will affect us. Now, other factors that we can consider when considering this public power transition is that climate change might be starting already to expose the vulnerability of the grid. As we know, as maybe all of you know, California, which is where I moved from just in September, has been pushing towards microgrids. And what that means, their push is mainly motivated by the fact that there's so many fires and the electricity infrastructure over there is failing and there's blackouts. So it's mostly for reliability issues. But are we also not expected to see disturbances in our regional climate due to climate change already in the pipeline? The answer is most likely yes. Now, looking at very present subject, which is the pandemic, how does a smaller utility have a better chance to do well during the pandemic? Does a decoupled utility does better? We know that the revenues for the big utilities are going down mainly because they tie profits to consumption. And if things are going down, they're going down too. Now, this question about city versus county PUD, maybe it's a question of decision-making facility and diversity. Smaller communities might have similar values, which makes it easier to agree on common goals. But in case of renewables, larger footprint increases resource diversity, which also improves reliability and cost allocation. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Froy. That was wonderful. Really appreciate it. So moving on, we have Annette. Annette Creekpaum. She is the general manager of the Mason PUD 3 based in Shelton, Washington. She has over 40 years of finance and executive management experience. Annette is a future-focused leader with values, collaboration, and planning, continuous improvement, and systems thinking. She became the PUD manager in 2013, spearheaded many different projects, including strategic planning, utility reorganization for efficiency, rate restructuring, automated meter infrastructure and grid modernization deployment, a community solar initiative, conversion of street and area lights to LED, and an enterprise software conversion implementing a rural broadband to the home initiative, fiberhoods, in quotes, and 2 state broadband grants and 1 federal broadband grant. She also, just so you know, Mason PUD provides electricity to nearly 34,000 customers in most of Mason County and small portions of Kitsap, Grays Harbor, and Pierce counties. These 3 service territories cover nearly 600 square miles. And they also operate a wholesale fiber optic telecommunications network, which supports the operation of its electric distribution services. So with that, I appreciate, as did Debra and Atul, share at the beginning what it is that you're going, what your focus is of your presentation. So Annette, take it away.
I did want to go through, you know, how our PUD was formed, which was 81 years ago. In general, you've heard a few things about in Washington State. It was through a combined effort of farmers, through the Granges, because the privates would not invest in the infrastructure to the rural areas. So it was a controversial measure and it was the first initiative in the state known as the Grange Bill. But in Mason County, we housed the first PUD in the state, Mason PUD 1, even though Mason PUD 3 was formed at the same time. But we did not begin serving customers until 1939 due to a lawsuit that was happening at the same during that time.
Annette, do you want to try to share your screen? You were a co-host. You can hit share screen, perhaps it should work.
Yeah, it's like it's locked up.
Oh, okay.
And I even changed batteries because I thought it was my mouse, but it's not my mouse.
Okay,
So
okay, go ahead. I'm
something's
sorry.
locked. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, unfortunately. So this whole legal process took a while, but you know, the benefit for Mason 3 is that being public utility, the people is still ingrained in every decision that we make. And so we're customer centric. So the public power utility, in addition to being customer centric, there's other benefits to the community, including being not for profit. Everybody's talked about. Customers have a voice in policy setting through their elected officials. And as a government entity, we are transparent by nature and statute. Perhaps the most important benefit is the first one. But at Mason 3, we know that approximately $2.6 million stays in our community because we are not for profit compared to if we were a private provider. We also did a history book for our 80th anniversary, and you can get that from our website. It's pud3.org/book, and this is kind of what it looks like. It's a pretty big book. You could download it off our website if you wanted to. So it tells you all about that. We have quite a few successes that we do like to talk about, and one of it is our fuel mix. So we're most proud of that. We purchased 97.5% is carbon-free. When we take into account the renewable energy credits we're required to purchase for the EIA, the Energy Independence Act, we have a net carbon footprint, a net zero, at approximately 110% carbon-free. So in the slide that I would have shown you, it shows that, you know, we're at hydro that we get from Bonneville at almost 79%. Then we have some Energy Northwest, which is some nuclear, at over 9%, and wind, which is just about 9% from Energy Northwest and Lakewood Light and Power, and some solar that we have on site, and some unspecified resources from Bonneville. Then we talk about our rate philosophy, and you know, each utility can come up with their own based upon their own philosophies for their district. But a success that we've had at Mason 3 is our financial health. We've had 15 consecutive awards for excellence in financial reporting, and we've not had an audit finding in over 40 years. So one of the things that we do manage is our finances for our rate philosophy. So every utility will have that unique philosophy for their customer base. So at Mason 3, we try to utilize a base charge. So we do a daily system charge to cover our costs to operate the utility, and then work towards having our energy rate as more of a pass-through cost. So the reason why we do that is we're largely a residential distribution utility with a significant seasonal customer base, which is over 25%. Therefore, if someone isn't using electricity often, they're still paying their share of the maintenance and operation of the system. So it's available when they need it. Then also we do waive that base charge for low-income seniors. So it's a nice thing to be able to do. Areas that have a large commercial or industrial customer base can look at these things differently. Then we do system capacity fees. And so another unique financial solution that we utilized was setting that up. And so that fee is intended so that growth pays for growth. So we like to say that my low-income grandma is not paying for your large private commercial business growth. So it's really based on the numbers. So if you add 200 amp service to a transformer, you're paying $1,700 for that. Then rural broadband is another success for us. If I had to rank our successes on how we're approaching rural broadband, that would be near the top of the list. But I'd like to start out explaining that we've been building our gig speed fiber network for 20 years. So Debra had mentioned about being part of Annette, and we are too, and that was 20 years ago when we started. Having a designated secure system to operate our electric system is the most reliable method. It saves our electric customers about $4.3 million per year to not have to pay an outside entity for that service. But the most popular use of our fiber optic network is really the fiber to the home network. Having a network that has over 20 years have supported our grid modernization project that has allowed our mesh system of wireless meter reading, but our grid mod also helped get our fiber out even further into our rural areas, which is where now we affordable began reaching those customers. We also changed our construction standards to think of our future fiber installs. Anytime we opened a ditch, we added fiber conduit, and any overhead construction, we strung fiber. This helps keep our costs down since our crews were already there. We developed that program called Fiberhoods, which helped us recover those costs in neighborhood builds over a 12-year period. That keeps it affordable for our customers, and we're getting closer to reducing that digital divide. We've also been doing aggressively going after infrastructure funding to help us achieve this, much like the rural electrification of the 30s. PUDs are in a good position for those rural customers to make this a financial sense to pencil out compared to what privates do. But I did think that I would mention that because of our network, we're able to quickly deploy 22 hotspots for free Wi-Fi throughout our county to support distance learning and economic impacts from this pandemic. We are also able to rapidly move office employees from home with a designated fiber line back to the PUD. We would not have been able to do this without that mature network. But our grid modernization project will save the utility money in the long run by adding those efficiencies in our workflow, and we replaced our outdated meters that needed replacement anyway, and it eliminated the need to read meters physically. It also has shown to be excellent for reliability and that customer service tool. We're able to manage those outages quickly, and our customers can see for themselves on their smartphone actually the status and location of their outages through our outage map. But our next phase will be looking at monitoring line loads and remote equipment, which will be a significant savings if we can reduce that line loss. So you'll have a map or a chart that shows the savings of how we justified the grid mod project and the ultimate savings to the district over several years. So that was pretty good. And then our EVs. So finally, our newest successful initiative was stepping into the EVs and a beneficial electrification role. Because we have such a clean energy, our strategy was to help use that and clean up the transportation sector carbon emissions. So we developed policies and initiatives for customers to purchase and install chargers for EVs. We're also working with local partners on installing more commercial chargers. So that is it for me, but I'll be happy to answer any questions, and I can try and get this PowerPoint presentation to you so you can look at it later.
Thank you, Annette. That was wonderful. Yeah. Jim, I'm going to read your bio, so we're ready for you. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, Jim Lazar. Is that right, Lazar?
Correct.
Okay, awesome. Is an economist and one of the first graduates, 1974, from Huxley's College of Business CBE program in environmental economics at Western. Since 1982, he has been a consultant in electric utility regulation, planning, and management. Much of this time he has been as a senior advisor with the Regulatory Assistance Project, providing training and technical assistance to utility regulators around the world. I would have to say that he probably comes with a great deal of expertise in this area, many, many years. And he has written several handbooks on the electric utility industry. Jim lives in Olympia and is a former Thurston County Public Utility District Commissioner. Howard posted up here that if you want to read about Jim's work on electricity utility regulation, it's some of the most lucid and insightful explanations on this complex subject, available at the Regulatory Assistance Project. So it's something that you can Google and find. So Jim, with that said, if you can, you're going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen, right?
Right, you're going to show my slides.
Yep, and
hopefully we will have no hiccups here.
Right.
You've heard my bio. If you have any memory of who I might have been, I'm trying to share. I turned off my video so that it should show a picture of me when I was in Bellingham. We can skip the bio and go on to the next slide. There's 54 electric utilities in Washington. 3 of them are private, and 51 of them are some sort of consumer-owned utility. Co-ops, PUDs, municipal utilities, irrigation districts, one tribal utility. Next. What's unique about public power and the cooperatives is they have access to BPA, and we've just heard that Mason 3 buys almost all of its power from Bonneville. The BPA hydro and nuclear system gives preference to public bodies and cooperatives. In 1980, Congress passed the Northwest Power Act. It was pitched as providing equal access for private utility residential customers. That was not achieved. We get, those of us who are PSE customers, get an exchange credit on our bill, but it makes up less than 1/3 of the difference between the cost of PSE's power supply and the Bonneville rate. Now, there's no real power that changes hands. So there's no carbon savings in the residential exchange as there would be if we were a utility actually getting power from Bonneville. And there's some available now. There's some that's available in the period. Next.
Just real quick, Annette, if you can mute your phone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I have the next slide, Jill? So this is the graphic that shows the 20 largest utilities in the state of Washington, those serving over 20,000 customers. Plus it also shows down there in green the city of Blaine, an average residential price per kilowatt hour. This is data from 2016 that I had handy. PSC is the most expensive of all of those utilities. The other private utilities are cheaper and all of the large publics are cheaper. And Blaine is not a very big utility, but it manages to have rates that are about 25% lower than PSC's. Next. Now, that was cost. This is carbon. PSC emits almost as much carbon as all of the Bonneville full requirements utilities in the state put together. PSC's power supply has a lot of coal, a lot of natural gas, a lot of purchases from other utilities that come from thermal sources. The public power utilities, because of their access to Bonneville, don't have that carbon. Next. Reliability is important. On the left is data from the American Public Power Association on reliability. This is measured in minutes of outage per year per customer. So a standard national measurement. And the Northwest is relatively high, and that's because we have trees here. We have trees and we have weather. You know, Los Angeles has no weather and Arizona has no trees. We have both. But within the Northwest, well, the average for the Northwest is about 180 minutes a year. PSC ranges to as much, about 400 minutes a year in Whatcom County, twice as much as the average Northwest utility outage, and up to 1,000 minutes a year, I think, is in their Kitsap County service territory. So the public power utilities seem to do a better job overall on reliability. It's not because there's an absence of trees in Mason County or in Grays Harbor County. There's plenty of trees in public power service territories. Next. So there's a lot of alternative utility forms that you can choose from. Public utility district, you have one that provides one customer with electricity and many with water. Electric cooperatives can be formed, and there's nothing that would bar anyone from setting up an electric cooperative in somewhere in Whatcom County to offer electricity service. There are municipal utilities, such as the town of Sumas and the city of Blaine. And in California, there's something called community choice aggregation, which is an interesting option in which the private utility continues to own the wires, but a community-based organization becomes the power acquirer and supplier. And that would require legislative changes in Washington. But the first three options are available today. Next. I've been involved in activating a number of public power utilities as a consultant, including some of this. These are 5 most recently activated in the Northwest. Emerald PUD outside of Eugene. I worked on that one. Columbia River PUD in Oregon, across the river from Longview. Oregon Trail Electric Cooperative in Eastern Oregon. I was a consultant to them. City of Hermiston, Oregon, and most recently Jefferson PUD. Activating a new public power utility is not for the faint of political heart. Next. The steps to activating a utility can begin with a petition. We heard that the citizens of Kitsap have not petitioned for electrification. A public vote on formation, if a PUD does not yet exist. A public vote on funding, most likely, although Whatcom may be exempt from that. Then there's the process of acquiring or constructing a system, eminent domain action to take over the private ownership, appraisal, negotiation, a trial on the values, probably an appeal on that decision, A lot of lawyers billing a lot of hours. Then the technical work of system separation to separate the part you're buying from the part you're not, the cutover, and then ultimately operation of the utility. There's a lot of steps. Next. So the political stamina is required. We'll start with a friendly takeover. Jefferson PUD. Utility was formed in 1939. It began water operations in 81. They had their vote to go electric in 2008. They reached an agreement with PSC, did not have to go through condemnation, but even so, it was 5 years from the electric system vote to operation. And Jefferson paid 3 times as much as the system was valued on PSC's books. And as a result of that, Jefferson's PUD's rates are about 10 to 20% higher than PSC rates for residential customers. Next. So then a hostile takeover, Emerald PUD. I worked with them beginning back in the late 70s. They had their formation election in 1978, a bond authorization vote in 1981. They initiated a condemnation. Before that case went to trial, Pacific made a deal to sell them the system. Conveniently, they agreed to sell it pretty cheap. And I was there on November 17th, 1983, when it cut over. But it was a 13-year process involving 14 different lawsuits. So once again, a lot of lawyers billing a lot of hours. Next. And I was involved when I was a commissioner. We had a public power activation petition before the voters here. As a commissioner, I was involved in overseeing a feasibility study in which the PUD invested some money after the citizen petition had forced a ballot measure. We identified some phased options that our consultant thought would save customers money. But in the election, PSC's campaign spent almost $750,000, by a factor of 7, the most that had ever been spent on a political campaign in Thurston County. And the final vote was 40% yes, 60% no. There is another active group to electrify Thurston with through the PUD again, and a municipal proposal, but both of those campaigns are kind of unable to function under current circumstances. Next. You heard from Atul, the Whatcom PUD has some existing authority. I copied a section out of their website, and the last line, the PUD currently has legal authority to supply water and electricity everywhere in Whatcom County, with the exception of electricity in Blaine and Sumas. If that's true, the PUD may be able to skip some of the steps, but still the process of condemnation, appraisal, negotiation, separation, and operation are not insubstantial steps. Don't think it's going to be easy. Next. If I compare the options, municipal utility, co-op, PUD, or community choice aggregation to PSC, my own analysis is that a city utility has the most advantages. It has the lowest costs because you'd only be acquiring the densely populated part of the system. It has a high degree of consumer control because people pay attention to city council elections more carefully than they pay attention to special district elections, whether it's PUD, port, or school board. And the city has some economies of scale. They operate a water and sewer utility. They're already billing customers. They have a billing system, payment collection system. So I think the cost advantage is on a municipal. In Whatcom, there may be an advantage in moving ahead with PUD because it is an existing electric utility, and if it can avoid some of the steps of the process, that may be an advantage. But if I were working on the campaign up there, I would be more focused on a municipal utility, in part because a municipal utility can also provide natural gas. And taking over the gas system at the same time from Cascade, at the same time that you took over the electric system from PSC, would give the city a great deal of control over the energy future and carbon future of consumption within the city. Next, and I think we're finally going to get to some questions.
Thank you for that, Jim. That was fantastic. I want to make note of the time. It's 8:30. We did spend some time doing intros. That wasn't part of our plan, but I do think it was valuable for everybody to know who's all here and the interest that everybody has. So if you would like to stay for questions, we will continue with the Q&A portion of this. If you need to go, we are recording this and you'll be able to have access at a later time. But I do want to say at this point, if you do have to go and you would like to have access to this presentation, you will need to, we are asking people to become members of the Climate Reality Project chapter. And that way you will get added to the email list. And so the way to do that would be to go to climaterealityproject.org/chapters. And then you'll scroll down to the bottom of the screen. I am going to share my screen to show what that looks like here, just so people can see this. If you go, you can find us on Facebook and ask us to add you to the email as well, Climate Reality Bellingham chapter, or I have to move this, or you go to climaterealityproject.org/chapters. The page looks like this. You can skip this, learn more about our chapters there, and goes directly down to here where it says find a chapter near you. And you can sign up there by just clicking sign up here to start receiving information. So either way. So now we will take questions. Hopefully, Daniel, you've had a second to queue them up.
Yeah, let me start with this question, which is, I know a lot of people will first respond to the possibility of municipalizing our power system in terms of financial cost. And so, Jim, you mentioned several times litigation to be expected, but I'm wondering if we could get some ideas from some of the panelists on how much the upfront cost would be, and is it the kind of thing like installing solar panels on your house where you pay a significant upfront cost and then over time there's a payback and you end up ahead of the game financially? But I wonder if some of the panelists could possibly speak to the financial cost, because I know that would be a point of contention among certain people as we move forward on this, if we move forward on this.
Well, there's two different sets of upfront costs. First, there's the costs of formation, which is legal costs and engineering costs to figure out what the system is worth, negotiate a price, and take control of it. And that's measured in the several $1,000,000 category. And then there's the cost of actually acquiring the poles and wires and transformers and substations that are already in whatever service territory you're acquiring. And that cost is measured in the tens of millions of dollars. But all of that typically is paid by issuing long-term municipal bonds at very low interest rates. Currently, municipal bond rates are down around 3%. By contrast, we're paying PSC about almost a 10% per year return on their shareholder investment, plus federal taxes. So if you compare a 3% mortgage to a 10% mortgage, you can actually carry that investment a whole lot cheaper than PSC can. The labor costs aren't going to be very different. PSC pays its line workers and other employees pretty well, and the PUDs pay their line workers and other employees pretty well, and the city of Bellingham pays its workers pretty well. Those labor costs are not going to be very different, but the cost of amortizing the investment will be dramatically lower for public power because of the three advantages. It's tax exempt, so no federal income tax, the ability to issue tax exempt bonds, and nonprofit. And those three things put together make the cost of carrying capital about half as much as for a private utility.
Excellent. Any other panelists want to weigh in on that question?
So, Jim, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe Jefferson County spent $143 million for their acquisition.
Yep.
So, you know, doing population ratios and things like that, there's comparing Jefferson to Whatcom County, of course, quite a bit smaller population than Whatcom County. And there's many other, I mean, extensive work. Obviously, we'd be talking about a lot more money than that for just the distribution infrastructure, because in Jefferson County, there's no production assets. And in Whatcom County, there are 4 natural gas power plants. And then PSC also has hydro plants off of Baker Creek or Baker Lake. And so those are obviously also valuable, very valuable to PSC. So one could imagine it being in the many hundreds of millions of dollars.
Well, let me interrupt, because what Jefferson paid 3 times the assessed value of the system they bought. And I think Jefferson made a really serious mistake in paying way more than they should have. I only did a little tiny bit of work for one state agency on the Jefferson acquisition. But I did a lot of work on the Kauai Island Utility Cooperative acquisition in Hawaii, the Oregon Trail acquisition in Oregon, the Emerald acquisition. Typically, takeovers happen at about 150% of book value. Jefferson spent almost 300% of book value. They spent twice as much as they should have for that system. So that's one important thing to consider. There's not a requirement for a Whatcom PUD to acquire the generation assets of PSC. You'd be under no obligation to acquire the gas-fired power plants, and you'd be under no obligation to acquire their hydro resources. Most of the public power takeovers have acquired only the distribution assets. There are exceptions. When Chelan PUD was formed in the 1930s, they did acquire the Rock Island Dam, which PSC had actually built the first really major dam across the Columbia River, or Puget Power had. And Chelan PUD did acquire that dam when they acquired the distribution system in Chelan County. But I think you should be looking at acquiring the distribution system and becoming a Bonneville customer or a wholesale market customer, rather than trying to buy PSC's gas-fired power plants.
It sounds like, Daniel, it's a complex issue that we need to assess the number, but there obviously is different opinions on the subject.
Well, a lot of money.
I want to celebrate everybody's willingness to delve into this complex issue, because we aren't going anywhere unless we're willing to deal with complexity. So again, I'm grateful to the panelists for coming here with their expertise, which many of the rest of us lack. So here's a question I'd like to take a little bit more time with. It's come up in a couple of contexts, and that is this choice between Whatcom PUD and something municipal, a municipalized PUD or MUD that would be isolated to the city of Bellingham. And I know that there are both political feasibility questions that associate with that watershed choice between MUD and PUD. I'm sure there are financial questions about that choice, and maybe there's a hybrid. Is there a way perhaps that Bellingham could operate an MUD under the auspices of the Whatcom PUD? So I want to kind of toss that out to the panelists and take a moment with that, if people could, please.
I don't know of any way to hybridize or to collaborate on the subject. Not because I'm not a team player. I swear I'm a team player. I just don't know how that works. Regarding Jim's point in one of his matrix, that may be a good slide to work off of, Daniel, on this conversation. And then I really appreciated the comment that Jim made about that, which was regarding the benefits of natural gas municipalization as well as electricity, and that's something that the PUD currently can't do. We can only do RNG. We can't do natural gas.
The city of Palo Alto, California has both electric and natural gas utilities. And they are in the process of phasing out the natural gas utility, except for those industrial processes, and there are some that really require natural gas. But in the short run, because they control the gas utility, they're ending the extension of natural gas to new residential and commercial construction. And under California's building code, the all-electric option is an extremely efficient building requirement. And so the new construction is going all electric. By controlling the natural gas utility, you have the ability to phase gas out. And I'm working on our local Thurston County Climate Action Plan, and there's simply no way of getting to an 80% reduction by 2050 without phasing out the use of natural gas. There's no way to get there.
Just to clarify, Atul, he was saying that as an MUD, we didn't have to purchase PSC's natural gas plant.
It's Cascades owns the natural gas plant up there.
The one that's at the waterfront?
The natural gas distribution system in Bellingham is owned by Cascade Natural.
Right. I was talking about the natural gas plant that PSC has.
There's one downtown, there's two in Ferndale, and there's one at Sumas.
Right.
Anyway, go ahead, Daniel.
Well, there's a lively dialogue going on in the chat box, so I'm sort of trying to keep up with us all. But if anybody is interested, you can try and track what's going on there as well. Anybody that has questions, please feel free to type them in. But I see that there's one more panelist that would like to weigh in on that question. Debra?
Actually, not that particular question. My focus typically turns back to telecommunications and also the opportunity to collaborate. What you can collaborate with your city and your PUD is within telecommunications, because your city has the authority to be a retail service provider. So the city and the PUD could collaborate to create internet service. That's one way you can collaborate with your city.
Okay. What about this question about retail provision? Could the PUD provide retail power to electric customers? Could the local PUD provide retail internet, for example, fiber optic internet to local customers? And is there a difference between what the PUD and a potential MUD could provide?
Debra here. Currently, PUDs are not allowed to provide internet retail service. It was something that the privates in legislation made sure that we couldn't, and we've been fighting that for about 20 years now. Kitsap has gotten our foot under the door by getting the limited retail, but certainly with this pandemic going on, I think that all of our representatives, government representatives, are seeing that this hasn't been working, and we're experiencing what happens when you try to leave this to the privates to provide this service.
I thought the point Annette made that Mason PUD is providing Wi-Fi hotspots, which is not retail provision, it's just giving away service at various points in their system in order to make internet available. One publicly owned utility, Burbank, California, that I've worked with, part of their smart grid rollout was a Wi-Fi mesh that connects the smart meters to the fiber optic ring around the city. And when they got it rolled out and they tested it, they found that they could read all 50,000 meters in the city in 9 minutes a month. And
wow.
then turned over the Wi-Fi mesh for free citywide Wi-Fi after that. And one of the sort of byproducts of a smart grid investment was free citywide Wi-Fi. And that was, you know, it's not very fast. It was fairly lightly used, but they eliminated the digital divide. Every kid in the Burbank schools that has a $30 tablet can connect to the internet from home. And that turned out to be incredibly valuable a couple of months ago when things closed down. Whereas here in Olympia, our school district is paying Comcast, has paid Comcast now to extend service to every student that didn't have service in order to facilitate distance learning. In Burbank, everybody had access to a public free Wi-Fi system that was a byproduct of the municipally owned smart grid system.
Cool. Excuse me. And again, the chat box is lively. A lot of questions are coming up there, and some are being answered in the chat box by other experts. So I'm going to let those go for the moment. One question that I'm certainly curious about, and we discussed coming into this as a group, was what would actually have to happen to kick the city into motion on embarking upon a feasibility study? The recommendation from the Climate Action Task Force is for a feasibility study to be considered, I believe is the word they use. What would it take for us to actually start that feasibility study? What might we expect such a study to cost, and how long might it take?
How many council members do you have?
7.
Takes 4 votes. Takes 4 votes and about $50,000. And I'm happy to share, I'll send it to Jill. I have the feasibility study that was done for the city of Olympia in the year 2000, and the feasibility study that was done for the Thurston PUD in 2012. And the second I have electronically, and the first I just promised I would scan it for some other people. And so once it's scanned, it's easy to share.
We, Daniel, we presented on the subject, Steve and I, in Hannah's committee, to the City Council Climate Action Committee. The meeting ended inconclusively, but certainly that was a topic of discussion at the City Council. And Seth was there, everybody was there.
So $50,000 buys you a preliminary feasibility study. When you actually get to trying to assess the value of the property, that's a detailed transformer by transformer, pole by pole engineering study, and a lot of legal work. And there you start getting into the $1 million range. But the preliminary feasibility study is not very expensive. The value of PSC's property in the city is publicly available, and the cost that it would take to operate a utility, one can take from utilities of similar size. A Bellingham utility would have about the same size staff as a Mason PUD number 3.
So I think
Richland would probably, the city of Richland might be, you know, the most comparable, but it might be the city of Centralia has a medium-sized utility. There's some good comparables that you can get examples of what it actually costs to operate a municipal electric utility.
I just want to add to Atul's point, the meeting had ended with the City Council being told that if they wanted to do a feasibility study, that it was doable, and that Atul, if I correct me if I'm wrong, that you were just like, yeah, if you want one, and then it was said to them that the city would have to say what they want in this study and figure out who's going to pay for it. So if it's a matter of the City Council figuring out what's in the study, it seems like looking at examples, that's kind of a no-brainer. If they need help from experts to figure out what should be in a feasibility study, we'll need to find out from the City Council if that's what they need. If they need money, then we'll have to figure out the money piece. We shouldn't have any barriers to moving forward, I would think. I just wanted to add that. We just have to solve the, move forward. So with that said, continue, Daniel, with the questions.
Okay, great. Yeah, it does sound like the rudiments of what would need to be included in the feasibility study could probably be made by the people on this call right now. That's not what we're going to do, but the wisdom to take that step is certainly here. One of the questioners was wondering about our carbon footprint under a PUD or MUD relative to what is accessible. I know PSE, since the Climate Action Task Force completed its recommendations, has been scrambling, in my observation, it looks like they're scrambling to try and come up with ways to provide clean power, green direct, whatever they call it, to try and maybe circumvent a motion towards public power. So how much more access and how much more reliable would our path to zero carbon power be under a publicly owned option?
I think that the city could, as part of its franchise with PSE, in the next franchise renewal, require that PSE bring 100% clean power to Bellingham or to Whatcom County, depending upon which franchising authority comes up next. They have separate franchises with both. And so one option would be to negotiate with PSE to get a green direct power supply. Western is a green direct customer. I don't know if the city of Bellingham is or is not. The city of Olympia is a green direct customer. But it would be possible for PSE to acquire a cleaner power supply for a portion of its service territory. They're doing that for individual customers. I don't think there's any magic to doing it to a part of their service territory. That might be a faster way to get clean. PSE is also, however, working to utilize the loopholes that are in the state clean power plan to allow it to continue acquiring and using natural gas generation beyond the deadline of 2035 that's in the act. There's a loophole for, if you can't keep the lights on any other way. And I have written extensively on how you can keep the lights on without fossil energy, but that doesn't mean they won't be successful in using that loophole. So you would need to have a pretty firm agreement with them. If you become either operate a Bellingham municipal utility, you would essentially instantly become as clean as the systems in Blaine and Sumas and the other public power utilities that I showed on one of my early slides on my slide 6. As soon as you got it activated. But as I said, the political stamina between here and activation is, it doesn't happen in 2 years. It happens in 5 or 7 years. And it might be a faster path to get PSC to agree to a clean power supply for Whatcom County or Bellingham.
There are a couple of people here who are on the Climate Action Task Force for the city of Bellingham, and they may have a clearer recollection than I do, but I seem to remember PSE sort of dragging their feet and saying, well, we're not sure how soon we might be able to go to zero carbon for the city of Bellingham. It might take quite a while. And that is one of the things that started making public power sound attractive to people like me.
Because Bonneville sets aside about 201 before, there we go, sets aside 250 megawatts of power for new public power entities in each contract period. And some of that, the only utility that's taken any of that in the last several years is Jefferson. There's plenty available to serve the Bellingham need. If you expand it out to all of Whatcom County, then you've got 2 oil refineries, and that's that might exceed what Bonneville has available if you were to try and serve both of them. But one of them's already being served by Whatcom. With the closure of the aluminum smelter, it's easier. That plant used more electricity than the whole rest of the county put together. But if you were able to activate a municipal utility tomorrow, you could put that load on Bonneville and become 97% carbon free the next day.
Interesting.
But it might take you 7 years to get there.
7 years. Okay, well, that was a question I had too, is what might be a realistic timeline. A couple of questions that have come up in the chat box. Again, some have already been answered in the chat box by other experts, but a couple of questions have come up specifically regarding Intalco. As we all know, I think Intalco is on the cusp of shutting down. There's a bunch of people scrambling to see if it can be saved. Maybe it can. Doesn't look like it can from where I sit, but there's a huge amount of electricity that has been used by Intalco, including the infrastructure to serve that, all the substations and everything else required to serve Intalco. I'm wondering what kind of opportunities might that circumstance of Intalco shutting down provide for us, those of us who might be interested in pursuing public power?
Well, first, the infrastructure is valuable in and of itself. To support additional industry in the Cherry Point industrial complex. So, substations and all that are expensive. They're been fairly well maintained. And for new industry that would want to come out that would require a significant amount of electricity, data center or whatever, it would be potentially beneficial to continue to maintain that well. In addition to that, Intalco's gone through significant changes in how it sources power. It used to be a special agreement with Bonneville Power, and they went into open market purchasing of their electricity relatively recently. And so it's unclear to me what the reduction in consumption by them does in terms of opening up possibilities. It certainly makes room for additional demand if it's appropriate for additional demand. Maybe other folks have more to contribute.
Yeah, Alcoa is direct in the market. They pay Bonneville for transmission services to Cherry Point, and that's been valuable to Bonneville. But the actual point of receipt, I think, was part of the smelter. So the transmission substation in which the power is delivered was actually as part of the smelter property. It's not Bonneville. But Bonneville brings 500 kV power to the site. And but the GM of the PUD is on the call, and maybe he can be unmuted and correct me if I'm misunderstanding some of that.
This is Steve Jelk. The transmission lines, the two radio lines coming out of the large Custer substation that's owned by BPA just north of Ferndale, those are owned by BPA. Both the low side and the high side of the large substation serving the Alcoa smelter are still owned by BPA. They have an agreement in terms of maintenance and facility replacement with Alcoa, but it is still, those facilities are still owned by BPA. And you're correct, Jim, all the power that the smelter uses today is bought on the market by Alcoa. It's not purchased from BPA.
We're running over, as you probably all know. We were shooting to end at 8:30. I think we're going to try and wrap up in the next few minutes. We have one more question I'd like to toss out there because it hasn't been answered by anybody else and is a little bit unique. And this would probably go to Atul. What are the options for the Whatcom PUD at creating its own generation system, solar or otherwise? And would that require a vote for the PUD to move ahead on creating its own generating facilities?
So the PUD, like any entity, because it's a utility that has electric authorization, could build a power plant or a solar array or a wind installation. Actually, we've looked at, for example, in the area of wind, Grays Harbor PUD has a very good template, in my opinion, of a coastal wind project that produces, I believe, around 5 megawatts. So Homebush County and other PUDs also have really good templates for community scale solar. There have been some folks in Whatcom County who have talked to multiple large players, including the energy companies, about a 100 megawatt scale solar installation. And there's nothing preventing the PUD legally. Of course, there's a lot preventing it financially, but legally, nothing preventing us from building a power production capacity and becoming an independent power producer that would then have to work out and identify customers for that electricity. So there's no hard requirements, prohibitions of that. Obviously, there's very many practical considerations. Our land in Western Washington is more expensive. We don't get as much insulation, which is the amount of solar energy per year, as they do in Eastern Washington. Energy Northwest has a couple of forays to me about the attraction of producing large-scale solar energy in the Richland area, and I'm sure we've all gotten offers like that at the PUDs. So there's a variety of different ways that we can work with other folks, or even in some cases take the lead in local power production.
Yeah, the economics are clearly the solar production is dramatically better on the other side of the mountains, and for the investment in your solar farm, you get a lot more electricity on the sunny side of the state. But then you have to transmit the power across the Cascades, and the Cascades is fairly congested. Those are pretty congested corridors. The owner of the Centralia coal plant, which is, one unit has shut down and the second will be shutting down, has begun a plan for 160 megawatt solar farm on the reclaimed coal mine just 20 miles south of my house in Tono, Washington. And I said to myself, you can't build solar in Western Washington. You can't get fuel for it. The sun doesn't shine. But I actually looked at the installation maps, and you get about a third less power by putting it in Western Washington. But you also plop it, in case of Centralia, right in the middle of the heart of the grid between Portland and Seattle, one of the most easiest places to get power from anywhere in the state, and avoid the cross-cascade transmission cost. And it turns out to be the transmission cost savings pretty much offsets the lack of sun disadvantage. So I didn't, when solar was 10 cents a kilowatt hour, that math didn't work. A penny to get it, a penny for transmission was cheap. But now that solar, the most recent solar farm in El Paso Electric just announced a contract at a penny and a half a kilowatt hour. And at that point, the cost of the transmission is almost as big a part of the cost as the cost of the solar built on the other side of the mountains. And if you can avoid that transmission cost by building here, if a penny and a half in Texas became 2.5 cents in Western Washington because of lower insulation, but you avoid the transmission costs, might be a good deal. And that's a change I really, didn't think that would be true, but I didn't really think that solar was going to be bid to utilities at a penny and a half kilowatt hour.
Great. Okay, one last question. What are the political pros and cons of having a popular vote to establish a PUD or MUD? It may or may not be required, the popular vote, I'm not sure, depending on the path we followed, but what are the pros and cons of going to the public for a vote on this?
I think irregardless of whether it's a public vote or not, when speaking to other PUDs, some of the ones that Jim referred to, and I very much want to hear if Jim agrees with what I'm about to say, is that it really helps to have a broad consensus from all the different sectors of a community for any kind of, whether we're talking about public fiber or we're talking about public power. It really is important for commissioners to do what they're supposed to do in terms of communicating as politically elected people in the community with the community, listening and educating. And without that, it's much, much harder and much more likely for execution to be poor, for planning to be poor, financing to be difficult. That's my thought.
Okay.
Jim, did you have anything to add to that?
A public vote is a good thing for expressing what the public wants. But it also, you know, whenever you start the process, you're also starting PSE's focus on retaining or obtaining seats on the governing body, whether it's Thurston PUD or whether it's the PUD or the city council. And so the political fortitude that's required includes making sure you can keep people in office after a public vote occurs to carry out the expressed intent of that vote. And that means doorbelling and phone calling and texting and writing checks for candidates. You know, in 2012, we had the petition. The petition was not approved by the voters, and PSE has worked very hard to make sure that it does not lose control of the PUD commission again. They've got at least 2 of the 3 commissioners do not favor resuming activities along the lines of activating the PUD. And so, you know, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It does look like if we pursue this, we're going to have a fight on our hands, which I'm up for, and maybe some of the rest of you are. Sure grateful to everybody that participated in this call. And just as an anecdote, I'm sitting outside my house, and I just got my end of the day solar report on my solar system, which just got put in last November. And so I hit a new high today in my solar production for my little solar system on my house. So it gives me hope and encouragement that we're moving in the right direction, and we'll get there in terms of getting carbon neutral. Let's just hope we can make it happen sooner, and it might take a lot of work. Thank you again, everybody, for participating. I'm going to hand it over to Jill to wrap things up.
Thank you, Daniel, for running that Q&A, and for everybody for the questions. Hopefully we got most all of them answered. I just want to close by having a couple asks, aside from saying thank you for joining. One of a couple of the asks for action items, like moving forward, you know, is number 1, to talk with your neighbors and your friends and your coworkers about public power. Help people get informed on what that is, what that could be, about public fiber, public electricity, public power, and to engage the community on that topic. The second is to email your city council and ask them to do a feasibility study. So there's no reason for us to sit and wait idle on this. They already started the discussion. They've had a presentation about it. Hannah, I appreciate you being on here because you're the chair of the climate action committee. So you probably will be getting some emails about that. But with that said, I wanted to cast a bit of a vision here, because we're in the bit of a crisis. We're in uncharted territory with COVID-19, and we can easily say that we have to kick the can down the road with climate change, which we continue to kick the can down the road by just having conversation, right? And it's like, okay, so how do we inspire action? And we can easily say that we can't afford as a city a feasibility study because we have budget constraints, right? So with that said, if we're talking about public power, I was sitting here crunching some numbers. I heard Jim say that it would be a $50,000, you know, feasibility study. Could cost about $50,000. So if you divide that by 1,000 people, that's 1,000 people, public people, paying $50. Now, how do we get 1,000 people to pay $50? Well, if there are 50 people on this call, which there were, and we each went out and asked 20 people to donate $50 for getting a feasibility study, I bet we all know 20 people. there you have it, $50,000. So I'm casting a vision that we might have to be creative. And if we get a barrier from the city saying, sorry, it's not in our budget, then maybe the public needs to, you know, bring it. I mean, we have to do things differently, and the climate cannot wait, as we all know. It's only going to get worse from here. So in terms of moving towards clean energy and looking at what we can do with public power, why this feasibility study is like our next step. So I just want to leave it with that. And again, if you want to get on our email list, please go to climaterealityproject.org/chapters. That's really hard to say. And fill out the form there, or find us on Facebook and send us a DM through Facebook at the Climate Reality Project Bellingham chapter Facebook page. We will try to get the presentation PowerPoints to people upon request. So I have to get those from the presenters at first. So know that those can come to those that would like those. And if there's anything else, please feel free to connect. We look forward to continuing this conversation. I can't thank you all enough for being on here and being part of the process and having the conversation onwards. Thank you, presenters, and thanks everybody for being here.
I'd like to thank you all as well. It's an awesome event. I really appreciate the panelists' time and everybody else.
Thank you, everybody. If you all want to undo your cameras and wave to each other, you can.
So long, everybody. Thanks for logging in.
Everybody, thanks for all your expertise.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, thank you. From being from the chapter 5 of the utility chapter starting in the early 90s, it's good to see this enthusiasm for the PUD and the electrical process in our county.
Thank you, Mike. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. So long.
Bye.